An obese widow asked the mountain man for shelter, and he said, "Only if you'll be my wife tonight." The storm howls across the high Colorado ridges. A desperate woman stumbles through the snow, her shawl torn, her last hope fading. But the man she turns to, rugged, scarred, alone, won't offer mercy without a vow. The wedding bells ring in the dead of night. But what begins as a bargain soon stirs whispers through the town. Behind every sideways glance lies a secret, a banker's betrayal, a railroad's claim, and a deed that could decide who owns the valley's only water. Barns will burn, jail keys will rattle. A widow once mocked will be forced to rise, standing against men who would crush her under their boots. She wanted shelter. Now she holds the future of the land in her hands. But can a marriage born of desperation survive betrayal, fire, and the weight of an entire town's scorn? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter wind howled across the Colorado highlands, whipping Martha Price's thin shawl around her shoulders like angry fingers trying to tear it away. Each step through the deepening snow felt heavier than the last. Her feet had gone numb hours ago, and now even the ache in her bones seemed distant, muffled by exhaustion and cold. The banker's words still rang in her ears. "Your husband's debts are due in full, Mrs. Price. The cabin and land are forfeit." She'd watched them nail up the notice, standing there in her Sunday dress, clutching her worn Bible while neighbors turned away in awkward silence. Now darkness was falling fast, along with the snow. Martha squinted through the swirling white, her heart leaping at a faint trace of wood smoke carried on the wind. Following that precious scent, she stumbled forward until finally, through the gathering gloom, she made out the dark shape of a cabin nestled against the tree line. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from its stone chimney. Her frozen fingers could barely form a fist as she knocked on the rough-hewn door. The sound seemed feeble against the storm's fury. She knocked again, harder, desperation lending strength to her arm. The door creaked open, spilling warm lamplight into the darkness. A tall man filled the doorway, his face half hidden by a graying beard. Deep-set eyes studied her from beneath a furrowed brow. A long scar ran down one side of his face, disappearing into his beard. "Please," Martha managed through chattering teeth. "I've nowhere else to go. My cabin was seized for debt, and I've been walking for hours." The man said nothing at first, just stood there watching her with those intense eyes. Martha noticed his right hand never strayed far from the rifle propped beside the door. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "Name's Jonah Keene." He paused, looking her over again. "You're half frozen." Martha nodded, hugging, herself tighter. "Martha Price, sir. I hate to impose, but might I warm myself by your fire, just until the storm passes?" Jonah's expression hardened. "Can't do that, ma'am." Martha's heart sank. She took a stumbling step backward, but Jonah's next words stopped her cold. "Can't have an unmarried woman under my roof. Wouldn't be proper." He straightened, meeting her eyes directly. "Only if you'll be my wife tonight." The wind howled in the silence that followed. Martha stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What?" "You heard me plain enough." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "I won't offer simple charity, but I will offer marriage, legal and proper, before God and witnesses." Martha's mind whirled like the snow around them. This stranger, this scarred, solitary man, was proposing marriage? Her legs trembled, whether from cold or shock she couldn't tell. "But you don't know me, Mr. Keene." "I know you're alone in a snowstorm with nowhere to go." He gestured at the white darkness behind her. "And I know you'll freeze if you stay out there much longer." She knew he was right. Already the cold had seeped so deep she could barely feel her feet. But marriage? To a complete stranger? Her late husband's face flashed through her mind. Poor Thomas, who'd left her nothing but debts and bitter memories. "It would be legal?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "A proper ceremony?" Jonah nodded. "Reverend Matthews keeps a lamp burning in the church window, about 2 miles down the valley. He'll marry us proper, storm or no storm." Martha looked down at her worn boots, nearly buried in snow. 2 more miles in this weather seemed impossible. But what choice did she have? She could feel judgment creeping in. What would people say about such a hasty marriage? But surely that was better than freezing to death in a Colorado snowstorm. "Very well, Mr. Keene," she said at last, lifting her chin. "I accept your proposal." Without another word, Jonah disappeared inside the cabin. Martha stood uncertainly in the doorway until he returned wearing a heavy coat, leading a sturdy mule already saddled. "Can't take the horse. He's too skittish in storms," Jonah explained, helping Martha onto the mule's back. "Old Bessie here's steady as they come." The mule's warmth seeped through Martha's skirts, and she gratefully gripped the saddle horn as Jonah took the lead rope. They set off through the deepening snow, Jonah breaking trail while Martha hunched forward against the wind. The journey seemed endless. The storm grew fiercer until Martha could barely see Jonah's broad back ahead of her. The mule plodded forward steadily, steam rising from its flanks. Martha's thoughts tumbled over each other like leaves in a whirlwind. What kind of man was this Jonah Keene, who would marry a stranger rather than simply offer shelter? Was this charity dressed up as marriage, or something else entirely? Finally, through the curtain of white, a yellow glow appeared. The church lamp, burning steady and bright. Martha had never seen a more welcome sight. As they drew closer, she could make out the small wooden church, its steeple reaching up into the swirling snow. Jonah helped her down from the mule, her legs so stiff she could barely stand. He tied Bessie under the church's small covered porch, then knocked firmly on the door. After a moment, light spilled out as Reverend Matthews opened it, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Jonah Keene? What brings you out in such weather?" His eyes widened as he noticed Martha. "And Mrs. Price. Good heavens, come in, come in." They stepped into the blessed warmth of the church, the Reverend hurrying to add wood to the pot-bellied stove that heated the small space. Martha's frozen fingers burned as feeling returned to them. "We've come to be married, Reverend," Jonah said simply. Reverend Matthews looked between them, clearly startled. "Married? Tonight?" "Yes, sir," Martha spoke up, her voice stronger than she felt. "If you'll perform the ceremony." The Reverend studied them both carefully. "This is rather sudden. Are you quite sure?" "I am," Jonah said firmly. "Mrs. Price needs a home. I need a wife. We're both of age and free to marry." Martha nodded her agreement, though her heart was pounding. The Reverend's hesitation was clear on his face, but after a long moment, he sighed and reached for his Bible. "Very well. We'll need witnesses." He moved to the door and rang the church bell, 3 sharp peals that cut through the storm's howl. "That'll bring the Hendersons from next door. They always come when the bell rings, weather be hanged." Sure enough, within minutes, the door opened to admit a middle-aged couple, shaking snow from their coats. They listened with wide eyes as Reverend Matthews explained the situation, but they asked no questions, simply took their places in the front pew. Martha stood beside Jonah before the altar, her sodden shawl dripping onto the wooden floor. She sneaked glances at his profile, as Reverend Matthews began the ceremony, the strong line of his jaw beneath his beard, the scar that spoke of some past violence, the way he stood straight and steady as a pine tree. When it came time for the vows, Jonah's voice was clear and firm. Martha's own voice shook slightly, but she got the words out. The Reverend pronounced them man and wife, and just like that, Martha Price became Martha Keene. The Hendersons signed the marriage certificate as witnesses, then hurried back to their own home. Reverend Matthews gave them a copy of the certificate, his expression still troubled. "God be with you both," he said as they prepared to leave. "I trust you know what you're doing." Back out in the storm, Jonah helped Martha onto the mule once more. The wind seemed to have died down somewhat, but the snow was still falling heavily. As they began the journey back to what was now their shared home, Martha clutched the marriage certificate, inside her shawl, wondering what kind of life she had just agreed to. But at least she wasn't facing the storm alone anymore. Through the swirling snow, the small church's lamplight beckoned like a beacon of hope. Martha could barely feel her fingers clutching the mule's saddle as Jonah led them to the humble building. The weathered wooden structure stood firm against the howling wind, its single window casting a warm yellow glow across the fresh fallen snow. Reverend Silas Alcott was securing the shutters when they approached. His eyes widened at the sight of them emerging from the storm like specters. "Good heavens! Jonah Keene? And who's this poor soul with you?" "Martha Price," Jonah said, helping Martha down from the mule. Her legs trembled as her feet touched the ground. "We've come to be married, Reverend." The preacher's weathered face registered surprise, then concern. He ushered them quickly inside, where a pot-bellied stove radiated blessed warmth. "Married? Tonight? In this weather?" "Yes, sir," Jonah replied firmly. "It can't wait." Martha stood dripping onto the wooden floor, her face burning with shame despite her numbed cheeks. What must the Reverend think of her? An unmarried woman, arriving in the night with a stranger, requesting immediate marriage? The Reverend turned kind eyes toward her. "Mrs. Price, are you certain about this?" Martha squared her shoulders, though her voice quavered. "I am, Reverend. Mr. Keene has offered me shelter, but only as his wife. He insists on doing things proper." "I see." Reverend Alcott studied them both carefully. In the corner, an elderly couple who had sought refuge from the storm watched with curious eyes. "Well, we do have the required witnesses present. Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker have been waiting out the weather." The elderly couple nodded in greeting. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes held sympathy as she took in Martha's bedraggled appearance. "But before we proceed," the Reverend continued, "I must ask, you're both free to marry? No prior commitments?" "My Thomas passed last spring," Martha said softly. "The banker took our cabin last week." "Never been married," Jonah stated simply. The Reverend nodded slowly. "And you understand the gravity of marriage? This isn't something to be entered into lightly, even in desperate circumstances." "I understand duty and honor, Reverend," Jonah said. His voice was rough, but carried conviction. "I aim to provide for her proper, as a husband should." Martha glanced at him, surprised by the strength of his declaration. In the lamplight, his scarred face looked less severe, though no less serious. "Very well." Reverend Alcott moved to retrieve his Bible and registry book. "Let us proceed, then. Mrs. Whitaker, would you help Mrs. Price arrange herself a bit? Mr. Whitaker, please light the altar candles." Mrs. Whitaker approached Martha with a gentle smile, helping her remove her sodden shawl and smoothing her wind-tangled hair. "There now, dear. You'll do just fine." Martha's hands shook as she tried to straighten her damp skirts. She had never felt more uncomfortable, more exposed. Yet something in the old woman's kindness steadied her. The small church glowed softly in the light of lamp and candles as Martha took her place beside Jonah before the altar. The wind rattled the windows, but inside, a solemn hush fell over the small gathering. Reverend Alcott opened his Bible, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet space. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words of the ceremony washed over Martha like warm water. She sneaked glances at Jonah, who stood straight and tall beside her, his expression unreadable. When it came time for the vows, his voice was clear and unwavering. "I, Jonah Keene, take thee, Martha Price, to be my wedded wife." Martha's own voice trembled slightly as she repeated her vows, but she got through them. Then Jonah surprised her by pulling something from his pocket. A ring. It was a simple gold band, obviously old but well cared for. "My mother's," he murmured, as he slipped it onto her finger. His calloused hands were unexpectedly gentle. Martha stared at the ring, emotion catching in her throat. She had expected a purely practical arrangement, yet here was this tangible symbol of family, of continuity. The metal warmed quickly against her skin. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," Reverend Alcott proclaimed. Then his voice softened as he added, "Sometimes the Lord uses storms to bring people together. His ways are mysterious but always purposeful." Martha felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from humiliation or comfort, she wasn't sure. Perhaps both. The Whitakers signed the marriage certificate as witnesses, their gnarled hands steady on the pen. Reverend Alcott provided a copy for Jonah and Martha to keep, then offered a final prayer of blessing over them. "Take care of each other," he said as they prepared to leave. "Marriage born of necessity can grow into something beautiful if you nurture it with patience and kindness." The storm had calmed somewhat as they stepped outside, though snow still fell steadily. Jonah helped Martha back onto the mule, then led them carefully through the deepening drifts toward home. Their home now, Martha realized with a flutter of anxiety. The journey seemed shorter this time, though Martha's skirts were soaked through by the time they arrived. Her new ring caught the light as she gripped the saddle horn, a strange comfort in the darkness. Jonah's cabin appeared through the snow, its window dark but chimney still smoking faintly. He helped her down from the mule, supporting her when her legs threatened to give way. His arm was strong and steady around her waist as he guided her inside. The fire had burned low during their absence. Martha collapsed onto a chair near the hearth, while Jonah tended to the mule and brought in more firewood. She watched through exhausted eyes as he built up the fire, its warmth gradually seeping back into her chilled bones. When the flames were crackling properly again, Jonah moved to a rough-hewn table in the corner. Without a word, he took down a second plate from a shelf and set it beside his own. The simple action spoke volumes. He was making space for her, acknowledging her place in his home. Martha sat very still, overwhelmed by the events of the night. Just hours ago, she had been wandering desperate in the storm. Now she was married, with a roof over her head and a ring on her finger. The situation was far from ideal. Yet somehow, watching Jonah move quietly around the cabin, she felt an unexpected flicker of hope. He had offered marriage instead of charity, insisting on giving her a proper place rather than mere shelter. There was honor in that, she realized, and perhaps something more. The pale winter sun crept through frost-etched windows, casting diamond patterns across Martha's face. She stirred beneath the heavy quilt, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar ceiling beams above her. The events of the previous night rushed back, the desperate trek through snow, the hasty wedding, returning to this cabin as Jonah Keene's wife. The quilt wrapped around her shoulders was thick and warm, pieced together from wool scraps in sturdy patterns. Martha realized she had slept more soundly than she had in weeks, months even, free from the gnawing anxiety about shelter and survival. Rich aromas filled the cabin. Coffee and… could it be bacon? Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten properly in days. Shifting carefully on the narrow cot Jonah had arranged for her near the hearth, Martha sat up and smoothed her rumpled dress as best she could. Across the room, Jonah stood at the cooking fire, his movements precise and practiced. He had already been up for hours, judging by his outdoor clothes and the snow melting from his boots by the door. The sight of him cooking gave her pause. She hadn't expected a solitary mountain man to have such domestic skills. "Morning," he said quietly, not turning around. "Coffee's hot if you want some." Martha rose, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders like a shawl. "Thank you," she murmured, reaching for the tin cup he had set out. The coffee was strong and black, warming her from the inside out. At the rough-hewn table, Jonah had laid out a simple breakfast: bacon, corn pone, and the last of what looked like summer's preserved apples. He gestured for her to sit, then took his own place across from her. Martha hesitated, painfully aware of how her size might strain the bench, but it held firm. She waited for the comments about her appetite, the sideways glances she'd grown used to over the years. But Jonah simply bowed his head for a brief grace, then began eating with methodical care. His silence wasn't uncomfortable or judgmental, just peaceful. As they ate, Martha took this opportunity to study her new home in the clear morning light. The cabin was small but solid, built to withstand mountain winters. Tools hung in ordered rows along one wall: axes, saws, traps, and implements she didn't recognize. Stretched hides were drying near the ceiling, and bundles of herbs hung from the rafters. What caught her eye, though, were the scripture verses carefully written out and nailed above the door. "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help," she read silently, recognizing Psalm 121. So he was a man of faith, as he'd claimed. When they finished eating, Jonah stood and reached for his coat. "Need to check the stock," he said. "Show you around if you're willing." Martha nodded, grateful for his matter-of-fact approach. She wrapped herself in her shawl, still damp from the night before, but Jonah surprised her by pulling a spare wool coat from a peg. "Here, it'll be warmer." The coat was too big, but Martha welcomed its weight and warmth as they stepped outside. The storm had passed, leaving the world transformed. Fresh snow blanketed everything, sparkling like scattered diamonds in the morning sun. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the sharp scent of pine. The barn stood a short distance from the cabin, its rough logs weathered to silver. Inside, the space was dim but warm with animal heat. 2 horses nickered softly in their stalls, while a milk cow regarded them with calm eyes. Chickens scratched in the straw, and Martha spotted a cat curled up in the hay. "This here's Bess," Jonah said, patting the cow's flank. "Needs milking twice daily. Horses are Scout and Maple." He showed her where he kept the feed and tools, explaining his routine with simple clarity. Martha listened carefully, determined to learn. She had experience with farm work, though her late husband had often dismissed her efforts. Here, she sensed, her help would be valued. The morning passed quickly as they tackled the day's tasks. Jonah chopped wood with steady, powerful strokes, while Martha stacked it against the cabin wall. She was clumsy at first, dropping pieces and struggling with the weight, but he never commented or criticized. When they checked the fence line, they found a section damaged by snow. Without discussion, they worked together to repair it. Jonah handling the heavy posts while Martha held them steady. Her hands grew cold and red, but she didn't complain. By afternoon, dark clouds were gathering again. They hurried to finish the outdoor chores, feeding stock, gathering eggs, ensuring everything was secured against another storm. Martha's muscles ached from unaccustomed work, but she felt oddly satisfied. Inside the cabin once more, she found herself falling naturally into household tasks. She swept the floor, organized the shelves, and set about preparing their evening meal. Jonah had stores of dried meat, beans, and root vegetables. Simple fare, but plenty to make a hearty stew. As dusk approached, the lamp cast a warm glow through the cabin. They sat down to steaming bowls of stew, and Martha felt a flutter of pride when Jonah nodded appreciatively at the first taste. After the dishes were cleaned and put away, Jonah reached for a well-worn Bible on the shelf. Martha settled in her chair by the fire, expecting to drift off, but found herself drawn in by his quiet voice as he read from the Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." The familiar words washed over her like a balm. She watched the firelight play across Jonah's scarred face as he read, seeing past the harsh exterior to the gentle soul beneath. Here was a man who had carved out a life of dignity in the wilderness, who offered marriage instead of charity, who read scripture by lamplight. For the first time since Thomas's death, since watching their home and belongings sold to cover his debts, Martha felt the hard knot of loneliness in her chest begin to loosen. She was still a stranger here, still unsure of her place, but she was no longer adrift. The fire crackled softly. Snow began to fall outside the windows, and Martha felt her eyes growing heavy. This day, so different from any she had expected, had shown her glimpses of what might be possible. Not just survival, but perhaps, in time, something more. "Think there's another storm coming," Jonah said softly, closing the Bible. Martha nodded, pulling her quilt closer. "Yes," she agreed, "but we're ready for it now." His eyes met hers briefly, acknowledging the truth in her words. They were better prepared to face the storm together than alone. Sunday morning dawned bright and cold, the sun casting long shadows across the pristine snow. Martha stood before the cabin's small mirror, adjusting her best dress, the only one she'd managed to save from the banker's seizure. The fabric pulled tight across her middle, and she tugged at it self-consciously. "Best we get moving," Jonah said from the doorway. "Church starts at 10 o'clock. Martha turned, surprised. "We're going to services?" "Always do," he replied simply, already wearing his good coat, well worn but clean. "The Lord's Day is the Lord's Day, storm or shine." Her heart quickened with anxiety. The thought of facing the townspeople, of their questions and stares, made her stomach clench. But Jonah's steady gaze held no room for argument. This was clearly part of his routine, as fixed as feeding the stock or reading scripture before bed. Outside, Jonah had already hitched his old mule to a wooden sled. The animal's breath came out in white puffs in the morning air. He'd lined the sled with hay and blankets for warmth, and Martha felt a flutter of gratitude for his thoughtfulness. The journey into town was slow and peaceful. Snow crunched rhythmically beneath the mule's hooves, and the runners cut clean tracks through the fresh powder. Martha huddled close to Jonah, grateful for his solid presence and warmth. The morning sun made the snow-covered landscape glitter like crushed diamonds, but she barely noticed its beauty, her mind racing with worry about the reception that awaited them. As they approached the small church, Martha's fears proved well-founded. Townsfolk were gathering on the steps, and heads turned at their arrival. The whispers started immediately, carried clearly in the crisp winter air. "That's her, Thomas Price's widow. Married the mountain man, if you can believe it. Right there in the storm, they say. Desperate times call for desperate measures, I reckon." Martha kept her eyes downcast as Jonah helped her from the sled. She felt the weight of every stare, every judgment. They made quite a pair, she with her too-tight dress and ample figure, he with the long scar that twisted down his weathered face. The proper ladies of the town drew back slightly as they passed, as though their misfortune might be catching. Inside the church, the whispers followed them. Martha tried to focus on the familiar comfort of the space, the plain wooden pews, the pot-bellied stove warming one corner, the sunlight streaming through simple glass windows. But the murmurs continued, a constant undercurrent beneath the gathering congregation's movements. They found seats near the back, and Martha was grateful for the relative privacy. But then she heard it. A conversation not meant for her ears, yet clear as a bell in the acoustics of the small church. "Railroad's moving fast," one woman said to another. "Bought up the Price place soon as the bank took it." "That syndicate from Denver's behind it all," came the reply. "Need the water rights for their steam engines, they say." Martha's hands clenched in her lap. The banker had wasted no time selling her former home, it seemed. But the next words struck even deeper. "They've got their eye on Keene's Valley, too. Perfect spot for a line camp, with that spring of his. He won't sell. Man stubborn as a mule. Won't have a choice, way I hear it. Railroad's got the territory governor in their pocket." The words hit Martha like physical blows. Not just her old home, but their new one, too, threatened by the inexorable march of progress and profit. She glanced at Jonah, but his face remained impassive, giving no sign whether he'd heard the gossip. Reverend Alcott took his place at the pulpit, and the service began. Martha tried to concentrate on the familiar rhythms of worship, but her mind kept circling back to the whispered revelations. The same banker who'd seized her cabin was now working with the railroad. The same greed that had left her homeless was reaching for Jonah's land that was now her home too. The sermon passed in a blur. Martha barely heard the words about faith and perseverance, too caught up in her own turbulent thoughts. When the final hymn ended, she felt drained, as though she'd been through a physical ordeal rather than just sitting in a pew. Thus, ride home seemed longer, heavier with unspoken concerns. Martha couldn't hold back the tears that slipped down her cheeks, though she tried to hide them in her shawl. The weight of it all, the gossip, the judgment, the looming threat to their land, pressed down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. She felt Jonah's gloved hand come to rest on hers, where they lay folded in her lap. The gesture was small, almost hesitant, but it carried a wealth of meaning, protection, understanding, partnership. He didn't speak. Words had never seemed to come easily to him. But his touch said enough. The afternoon sun cast long shadows by the time they reached the cabin. Martha moved through her evening tasks mechanically, feeding the chickens, helping with the stock, preparing their simple supper. But her mind was working, turning over this new reality again and again. This marriage, begun in desperate practicality, had tied her to more than just Jonah. She was bound now to this land, to his fight to keep it. The railroad's threat was her threat, too. The whispers and judgment didn't matter. What mattered was that she had found a home worth defending. As she stood at the cabin door, watching the sun set behind the snow-covered peaks, Martha felt something solid forming in her heart. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was purpose, determination, the steely resolve that had helped her survive every other challenge life had thrown at her. Whatever came next, she would face it standing beside Jonah, protecting what was now theirs. Jonah joined her in the doorway, his presence steady and reassuring. Together they watched the day's light fade from the valley, their valley, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The morning after church brought a welcome change in the weather. The heavy clouds finally broke, revealing patches of blue sky above the snow-covered peaks. Martha stood at the cabin window, watching as sunlight transformed the crystalline landscape into a dazzling display. Jonah entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Storm's easing. Might be a good day to show you the property, if you're of a mind." Martha nodded, eager to learn more about her new home. She bundled up in layers of wool, following Jonah's example. Outside, the air was crisp but less bitter than previous days. Their boots crunched through the fresh snow as Jonah led her along what seemed to be a familiar path. "Watch your step here," he cautioned, offering his arm as they descended a gentle slope. The sound reached Martha's ears before she saw it, the musical gurgle of running water. They emerged into a small clearing where a creek wound its way through the valley, its waters dark against the white snow. Despite the cold, the creek flowed steadily, ice forming only along its edges where the current slowed. "Spring-fed," Jonah explained, his voice carrying a note of pride. "Runs year-round, never fails. Feeds the whole valley right down to the town below." Gestured downstream, where the creek disappeared around a bend. "Town's built up around it. Without this water, there'd be nothing but dust." Martha watched the flowing water, memories stirring. "Thomas, my late husband, he was always particular about water rights." She recalled him hunched over papers late into the night, muttering about claims and territorial law. "Said they were worth more than gold out here." Jonah nodded gravely. Man wasn't wrong about that. Something tugged at Martha's mind, a memory of Thomas tucking papers away, saying they might be needed someday. "I think," she began slowly, "I might have something in my trunk." They returned to the cabin, where Martha's few possessions sat in a battered trunk near the wall. She opened it carefully, sorting through the meager contents. A few clothes, her mother's tin of buttons, the family Bible wrapped in a faded shawl. The Bible's pages were worn soft with use, its margins filled with family births and deaths recorded in different hands. Martha's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages. There, tucked between the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah, she found what she sought, a folded document, its edges brittle with age. "Here," she said, holding it out to Jonah. He took it gently, unfolding the paper with careful hands. His eyes moved slowly across the legal text, taking in every detail. "This is a water rights deed," he said finally, looking up at Martha with new intensity. "Filed 15 years ago on the Price cabin property." He paused, studying the document again. "These rights are still valid, and now that we're legally married..." "They're yours," Martha finished softly. "Ours." The implications settled over them like a heavy blanket. The railroad couldn't simply take the valley, not without securing these water rights first. Martha, the woman the town looked down upon, held a piece of paper that could determine the fate of their home. They sat in silence as afternoon light slanted through the cabin windows. Martha watched shadows play across Jonah's scarred face, seeing the weight of memory there. Finally he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "There's something you ought to know," he said, carefully refolding the deed. "About why I live up here, away from folks." He stood, moving to stare out the window at his beloved creek. 10 years back, I worked as a ranch hand down in the valley. There was a dispute over water rights, not so different from what's coming now. Martha sat quietly, letting him find his words. His shoulders were tense beneath his wool shirt. Man tried to dam up the creek, starve out the downstream ranches. Jonah's voice grew distant with memory. Words turned to threats. Then one day, I found him sabotaging my employer's headgate. He drew on me first, but he touched the scar on his face unconsciously. I was faster. Been living with that death on my conscience ever since. Oh, Jonah, Martha whispered, her heart aching for the burden he'd carried alone. Swore I'd never spill blood again, he continued. Came up here to live quiet, try to make my peace with the Lord. He turned to face her, his expression troubled. But now this fight's coming to us, whether we want it or not. Martha rose from her chair, crossing to stand before him. The railroad's powerful, she acknowledged. They'll try to take what they want by force or by law. She reached for his rough hand, feeling the strength in it, strength that had known both violence and gentleness. But we don't have to fight their way. Jonah's fingers tightened around hers. How else can we stand against them? With faith, Martha said firmly, with the law on our side and God's guidance. She thought of the townspeople's whispers, the bankers' greed, the railroad schemes. Violence begets violence, but if we stand firm in what's right, others might stand with us. You sound mighty sure, Jonah said, a hint of wonder in his voice. I'm sure that God didn't bring us together in that storm just to lose everything to the railroad. Martha squeezed his hand. These water rights, they're a blessing, a way to protect what's ours without bloodshed. Jonah studied her face for a long moment. The setting sun painted the cabin in soft gold, warming Martha's plain features. She met his gaze steadily, letting him see her determination. Never thought to have a partner in this fight, he said finally. Never thought to have a home worth fighting for, Martha replied softly. They stood together as evening settled over the valley, their joined hands a promise stronger than any deed. Outside, the creek continued its eternal song, carrying water and hope through the land they now shared. The March winds swept through the valley, bringing change with each gust. Snow retreated in patches, revealing dark earth beneath. Martha stood at the cabin door, watching winter lose its grip on the land. The creek ran fuller now, swollen with melting snow from the high country. She was hanging laundry on the line when Jonah came around the cabin's corner, his expression alert. Riders coming, he said quietly. Apache families moving through the valley. Martha's hands stilled on the damp cloth. She'd heard stories about the Apache people but had never met any. Should we? She hesitated, uncertain. They're friends, Jonah assured her. Been sharing this valley peaceful-like for years. They camp by the creek when passing between hunting grounds. Soon, Martha could see the group approaching, several families with loaded pack horses, moving at an unhurried pace. Children darted between the horses, their laughter carrying on the wind. As they drew closer, Martha noticed the intricate patterns in their clothing and the careful way they handled their belongings. Jonah stepped forward to greet them, speaking a few words in their language. The leader, a dignified man Martha would come to know as Nanton, dismounted and clasped Jonah's arm in greeting. His dark eyes were keen and observant as Jonah introduced Martha. "This is my wife," Jonah said in English, then repeated something in Apache. Nanton nodded to Martha with grave courtesy. "Welcome to our creek," Martha found herself saying. The words felt right, even if her voice shook slightly. The families made camp near the water, their movements speaking of long practice. Martha watched, fascinated, as the women set up shelters and children quickly gathered firewood. One woman began weaving a basket, her fingers moving with practiced grace through the reeds collected near the creek. "Would you like to see?" the weaver asked in careful English, noticing Martha's interest. Martha nodded, drawing closer. The woman's hands never stopped moving as she explained the pattern she was creating. Throughout the afternoon, Martha's initial nervousness melted away. She brought out cornbread and dried apple preserves, setting them on a clean cloth near the creek. The children approached shyly at first, then with growing boldness as she smiled encouragement. Jonah moved easily between the groups, translating when needed. Martha had never seen him so comfortable with people before. He showed a young boy how to mend a leather strap, speaking softly in mixed English and Apache words. As the sun began to set, Nantan approached Martha. "You have a good heart," he said, his English clear but measured. "A woman of endurance like the mountains." He gestured to the peaks. "Some bend in the storm, some break. You bend but stay strong." Martha felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected praise. "Thank you," she managed. "Please, will you all join us for supper?" The cabin had never held so many people. Martha's big iron pot bubbled with stew, venison, potatoes, and early spring greens. She ladled portions into every available bowl, her heart swelling as she watched people gather in comfortable groups around the room. For the first time since her arrival, she felt truly like a hostess rather than someone accepting charity. The cabin glowed with lamplight, warming the faces of their guests. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, eating with good appetite. Women shared tips about preparing herbs and preserving food, bridging the language barrier with gestures and smiles. As night deepened, someone began to sing, a low, melodious Apache chant that filled the cabin with its haunting beauty. When it ended, Martha gathered her courage and started the opening notes of Amazing Grace. To her joy, several voices joined in, the hymn rising in English and Apache words together. Jonah sat in his usual chair by the fire, but something was different. A smile played at the corners of his mouth as he watched the scene before him. The lamplight softened his scars, showing instead the gentle heart Martha had come to know. Later, after their guests had returned to their camp and the cabin grew quiet, Martha stood at the window. She could see the glow of campfires by the creek, hear the distant murmur of voices on the evening air. "I never thought I'd have this," she said softly. "Have what?" Jonah asked, adding wood to their own fire. "A home where I could welcome others, a place where I belong." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "When that storm drove me to your door, I thought God had abandoned me, but now I see. He led me exactly where I needed to be." Jonah didn't speak, but his eyes held hers as he nodded slowly, firelight dancing across his features. Together they listened to the creek's song mingling with the evening voices, a symphony of belonging in the growing dark. In that moment, Martha felt the truth of Nantan's words. She had bent but not broken, and here in this valley she had finally found her strength. Not in spite of her hardships, but because of them. She could offer shelter to others because she knew what it meant to need it herself. The night grew deeper, stars appearing one by one above the valley. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight Martha's heart was full. She had found more than just a marriage of convenience or a roof over her head. She had found purpose, dignity, and a family that stretched beyond the cabin's walls to embrace all who shared their valley's blessing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as 3 riders appeared on the ridge. Martha noticed them first from the cabin's porch, where she was shelling early peas. Their fine clothes and citified horses marked them as strangers, not the usual travelers or mountain folk who passed through. "Jonah!" she called, her voice carrying to where he worked in the vegetable patch. He straightened, shading his eyes against the sun. His shoulders tensed as he spotted the riders. "Get inside," he said quietly. but with unmistakable urgency. "Please, Martha." She gathered her apron full of pea pods and hurried to the cabin. Through the window, she watched the men guide their horses down the slope toward the creek. Their bearing spoke of authority, the kind that came from money, not honest work. Jonah set down his hoe and walked deliberately to meet them. Martha's heart hammered as she recognized the railroad company's insignia on their saddlebags. The same mark she'd seen on papers in town, documents that threatened to slice up the valley like a butcher's knife through meat. The lead rider, a man with a waxed mustache and expensive boots, dismounted first. "Well, if it isn't the hermit himself," he called out, his voice carrying clearly to the cabin. "Jonah Keene, the valley's own ghost story." Martha pressed closer to the window, straining to hear. Jonah stood his ground, hands loose at his sides. "This is private property," he said evenly. "State your business." The other two men laughed, sharing knowing looks. "Private property?" the leader sneered. "Not for long. Railroad's claiming right-of-way through this valley. Progress is coming, Keene, whether you like it or not." "My wife holds valid water rights to this creek," Jonah replied, his voice steady despite the mockery. "You'll find them properly filed at the county office." This brought another round of laughter. "Wife?" The second man peered toward the cabin. "You mean that fat woman we saw in town? That's rich, Keene. Didn't figure you for the type to hide behind a woman's skirts, especially such wide ones." Martha's cheeks burned with shame, but she kept watching. Jonah's hands had clenched into fists, but he didn't move. She could see the struggle in his rigid posture, the effort it took to stay calm. "You'll leave now," Jonah said, each word measured and firm. "And you'll show proper respect when speaking of my wife." The leader stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Or what, hermit? Everyone knows your story. One killing was enough to send you running to the hills. You won't risk another. Face it, you're nothing but a coward playing at being a landowner." Martha held her breath, watching Jonah's response. His right hand twitched, as if remembering the weight of a weapon. But he kept his arms at his sides, standing straight and tall. "I won't draw on you," he said clearly, "but this is my land, and you're not welcome here. Leave." The railroad men exchanged glances, clearly disappointed at failing to provoke violence. The leader spat on the ground near Jonah's feet. "Enjoy it while you can. When we come back, it'll be with papers and men enough to make sure you understand progress can't be stopped." They mounted up, wheeling their horses around with unnecessary flourish. "Better start packing, hermit," one called over his shoulder, "and tell your fat wife to be ready, though maybe the railroad will do her a favor. Walking to town might do her some good." Their laughter echoed off the valley walls as they rode away. Martha watched Jonah stand motionless until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did his shoulders sag, as if bearing an invisible weight. When he came inside, Martha was waiting by the fireplace, her hands twisting her apron. "You should have let me stand with you," she said, voice trembling with anger and hurt. "No." Jonah's response was sharp. "Those men came looking for trouble. They wanted an excuse." "So we hide? Let them mock us both?" Martha's voice rose. "I heard what they said about me, Jonah. I'm used to such talk. But to use my shame against you—" "There is no shame," Jonah cut in, his tone fierce. "You're my wife." "A wife of convenience." The words burst out before she could stop them. "Married because of a storm and desperation. And now my presence makes you look weak to those men." Jonah paced the cabin's length, agitation clear in every movement. "You think I care what they say? I care about keeping you safe, keeping this valley safe." "By refusing to fight?" Martha challenged. "They'll come back, Jonah, with more men, with papers. I won't draw a gun again." His shout startled them both. Martha had never heard him raise his voice before. I won't," he continued more quietly. "That path leads to darkness. I've walked it before, lost myself in it." Martha sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "Then what do we do? Watch them take everything?" Jonah stood by the window, staring out at the creek that had sustained him for so many years. "We fight," he said finally, "but not with guns. There are other ways, legal ways, ways that don't spill blood." "They won't fight fair," Martha warned. "No." Jonah turned to face her. "But we will, because that's who we are now, who we choose to be." The cabin grew darker as the sun set, shadows lengthening across the rough wooden floor. Neither moved to light the lanterns. In the growing dark, Martha felt the anger drain from her, replaced by something deeper, a certainty that this moment mattered more than any since their hasty wedding. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Not for arguing, but for doubting. This marriage may have started from necessity, but—" Jonah crossed the room slowly, his footsteps sure even in the dim light. He knelt beside her chair, taking her work-roughened hands in his. "Martha," he said softly, "nothing about you makes me weak. Your strength, your dignity despite their cruel words. It helps me remember who I want to be. A man of peace doesn't mean a man who won't fight for what's right." Martha's fingers tightened around his. "Then we fight together. Not with guns or fists, but with the law and our wits and whatever else God grants us." "Together," Jonah agreed. They sat in the darkness, hands clasped, until the first stars appeared through the window. Finally, Martha rose to light the lanterns, and Jonah built up the fire. The familiar tasks felt different now, weighted with new purpose. As the cabin filled with warm light, they moved around each other with a comfort born of shared resolve. Martha prepared a simple supper, while Jonah read from his worn Bible, his voice steady as he spoke ancient words of courage and perseverance. Later, lying in their separate beds, Martha heard Jonah's quiet voice in the darkness. "I won't let them drive us out." "I know," she replied softly. "Neither will I." The night settled around them, peaceful despite the day's confrontation. Martha listened to Jonah's breathing grow steady and deep, feeling an unexpected warmth in her heart. They had started as strangers forced together by circumstance. Now, facing this threat, she realized they had become something else entirely. True partners, bound by more than just necessity. Dawn would bring new challenges, but they would meet them together. Martha closed her eyes, peace settling over her like a familiar quilt. Whatever came next, they had found their strength, not in weapons or violence, but in their united stand and shared conviction that this valley was worth fighting for, the right way. 3 days passed in uneasy quiet. Martha and Jonah repaired winter-damaged fences, tended the animals, and tried to ignore the growing tension. But peace shattered on a moonless night when Martha woke to the acrid smell of smoke. "Jonah!" she cried, shaking him awake. "Fire!" They rushed outside in their nightclothes. Orange flames already crawled up the barn's wooden walls, casting hellish light across the yard. The spring night air carried shouts and the thunder of retreating hoofbeats. "The animals!" Jonah sprinted toward the barn door. Thick smoke billowed out as he yanked it open. Martha ran to the well, her hands shaking as she worked the pump. Water sloshed over her feet as she filled the first bucket. Inside the barn, Jonah fought through the choking smoke. "Easy, girl," he called to their mule, Sophie, who kicked frantically at her stall. The heat pressed against him like a physical weight. Flames crackled overhead, consuming the hayloft. Martha staggered into the barn with her bucket, throwing water at the base of the flames. "Jonah," she coughed. "Where are you?" "Here." He emerged from the smoke, leading the terrified mule. "Get back! The roof's going." Together they dragged Sophie toward the door, the mule fighting them every step. Behind them, burning timbers groaned. They barely cleared the doorway when the roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending sparks shooting skyward like demon fireflies. Martha stumbled backward, clutching Sophie's lead rope. The mule's sides heaved, nostrils flaring at the smoke. Jonah fell to his knees in the yard, coughing violently. "The chickens," Martha whispered. "The feed. Everything." They could only watch as the fire devoured their barn. The heat dried tears on Martha's cheeks before they could fall. Jonah's face was black with soot, his expression carved from stone as he watched years of work burn to ash. Dawn broke gray and cheerless. The barn was a smoking ruin, timbers still smoldering. Martha and Jonah hitched Sophie to the wagon, knowing they needed supplies to survive. The trip to town felt like riding to judgment. Main Street was busy with morning traffic when they arrived. Martha noticed how conversations stopped as they passed, how people turned to stare and whisper. She held her head high, though her dress still smelled of smoke. Deputy Wade Carver stepped into their path before they could reach the general store. "Hold up there, Keen." "Deputy." Jonah's voice was rough from smoke. "We've had trouble." "I know all about your trouble." Carver's hand rested on his gun belt. "Got word you've been harboring Indians, helping them sabotage railroad property." "That's a lie," Martha protested. "We only offered shelter to travelers, as any Christian should." "Quiet, woman." Carver cut her off. "Your husband's been seen meeting with Apache troublemakers, same ones causing problems for the railroad crews, and now there's mysterious fires starting up." A crowd gathered, drawn by the confrontation. Martha recognized faces from church, neighbors who'd shared meals with them, but now they looked at Jonah with suspicion, at her with barely concealed contempt. "You can't possibly think—" Martha started. "I said quiet," Carver barked. "Jonah Keen, you're under arrest for conspiracy and sabotage." "No!" Martha grabbed Jonah's arm as Carver produced handcuffs. "This is wrong. He's done nothing." Jonah gently detached her hands. "Martha," he said softly, "let me handle this. Listen to your husband, Mrs. Keen." Carver's voice dripped with mockery on her name. "Though I reckon that was quite the bargain marriage, weren't it? Desperate times call for desperate measures, they say." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Martha's face burned, but she stood her ground. "My husband is a good man," she declared. "He wouldn't—" "Your husband's a killer," someone called out. "Everyone knows it." "Now he's stirring up Indians against honest progress," another voice added. "Probably burned his own barn for sympathy." Carver clamped the handcuffs around Jonah's wrists. "Come along quietly, Keen. Don't make this worse." Jonah met Martha's eyes. "Go home," he said. "I'll handle this legally. Trust me." Martha reached for him one last time, but Carver roughly shouldered between them. "Back off, woman. Your husband's got some explaining to do." She watched helplessly as Carver marched Jonah toward the jail. The crowd's attention turned fully to her, their stares burning like brands. "Guess you'll have to find another desperate man to take you in," a woman sneered. "If you can find one willing to overlook your size," another added with a laugh. "Probably why she settled for a murderer in the first place." Martha's hands clenched into fists. She wanted to scream, to defend herself and Jonah. But she remembered his words about fighting the right way, about maintaining dignity. Drawing herself up to her full height, Martha turned to face the crowd. She looked each mocker in the eye, one by one, until they dropped their gazes. Without a word, she climbed onto the wagon seat and took up Sophie's reins. "Running away," someone called as she turned the wagon around. "No," Martha replied clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "I'm going home, to my husband's land, where I belong." She kept her back straight as she drove out of town, though tears blurred her vision. The jeers and laughter faded behind her, replaced by the steady clip of Sophie's hooves and the creak of wagon wheels. Only when the town disappeared around a bend did Martha let her shoulders sag. The morning's events felt like a horrible dream, but the empty wagon beside her and the lingering smell of smoke made it all too real. She thought of Jonah in that jail cell, alone with his memories of violence and his determination to stay peaceful. She thought of their burned barn, the lost animals, the water rights that now seemed to mean nothing in the face of progress and prejudice. But as she guided Sophie up the familiar trail to their cabin, Martha felt something steal itself inside her. They had tried to shame her about her size all her life. They had mocked her marriage, dismissed her dignity, and now they threatened everything she and Jonah had built. "No more," she whispered, her voice fierce and certain in the spring morning. "No more running. No more shame." The cabin came into view, smoke still rising from the barn's ruins. Martha set her jaw, determination replacing despair. She would fight for Jonah, for their land, for the life they were building. Not with violence or vengeance, but with the quiet strength she'd always carried inside. She would show them all what a woman of substance could do. The lone lamp cast wavering shadows across the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Martha knelt beside Jonah's empty chair, her hands clasped tight in prayer. The silence pressed heavy around her, broken only by the soft pop of the dying fire and the distant cry of a coyote. "Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling, "give me strength, not for myself, but for Jonah." Her fingers traced the worn wood of his chair, remembering how he'd sat here just that morning, reading from his Bible before everything fell apart. The lamp flickered, and Martha's mind drifted to that snowy night when Reverend Alcott had married them. His words echoed in her memory. God sometimes uses storms to knit lives together. She'd been so frightened then, desperate and cold. Now, facing a different kind of storm, Martha felt something shift inside her. She rose slowly, her knees creaking from the hard floor. The deed lay on the table where she'd left it, its edges worn from being hidden so long in her Bible. Martha picked it up, reading the faded words by lamplight. Her late husband's signature marked the bottom, alongside the official stamp proving their claim to the creek's water rights. "I won't let them shame me anymore," she said aloud to the empty cabin. Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I won't let them break us." Sleep came fitfully. Before dawn, Martha hitched Sophie to the wagon. The burned barn stood like a black skeleton against the pale morning sky, but she forced herself not to look as she drove toward town. Reverend Alcott was already awake, tending his small garden behind the church. He straightened when he saw Martha approaching, concern etching his weathered face. "Mrs. Keene," he said gently, "I heard about yesterday's troubles." Martha clutched the deed tightly. "Reverend, I need your help. They've wrongly accused my husband, and this paper might save him. Save all of us." Inside the church, morning light filtered through dusty windows as Martha spread the deed on a pew. The Reverend adjusted his spectacles, studying each line carefully. "These water rights are legitimate," he confirmed, "and now that you're Jonah's wife, they extend to his land as well." He looked up at Martha. "But you'll need more than paper to fight the railroad, child." "I know." Martha squared her shoulders. "I need allies, people who will stand with us." The Reverend nodded slowly. "Then let's start gathering them. First, we should visit Nantan. His people have as much stake in this creek as anyone." They found Nantan's camp near the creek bend, morning fires sending thin smoke into the dawn air. The Apache leader listened gravely, as Martha explained through the Reverend's translation. His dark eyes studied her face more than the deed she showed him. "You have endured much shame," he said finally in careful English. "Yet you stand tall, like the mountain pine that bends but does not break." He touched the paper respectfully. "My people will witness your truth. The creek gives life to all." By midday, word had spread through town. Martha's head held high. She walked Main Street with Reverend Alcott. Outside the general store, elderly Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, the same woman who'd witnessed their wedding. "That fire was wrong," Mrs. Thompson declared loudly. "I saw how hard you both fought to save those animals. That's not the work of troublemakers." Tom Wilson, the blacksmith, joined them next. "My boy was caught in that creek flood 2 springs back," he said gruffly. "Jonah Keene pulled him out, wouldn't take a penny in thanks. That's not a man who'd stir up violence." Martha's throat tightened at their support. More townspeople gathered, some still hostile, but others nodding thoughtfully. She clutched her deed, remembering Jonah's quiet strength. "I need to practice speaking," she told Reverend Alcott, as afternoon shadows lengthened. "I can't let my voice shake when I present this to the judge." They returned to the church. Martha stood before the empty pews, reading the deed aloud again and again. Her voice grew steadier with each attempt. "Speak from your heart," the Reverend advised. "Truth has its own power." As dusk settled over the town, Martha walked to the jail. Stars were just beginning to pepper the darkening sky. The building squatted dark and square, its few windows glowing with lamplight. She moved to the side window, where iron bars cut black lines across the yellow light. "Jonah?" she called softly. Movement inside. Then his face appeared, tired but alert. "Martha, you shouldn't be here after dark." "I had to come." She pressed close to the bars, lowering her voice. "I found allies today. Nantan will speak for us. The Reverend, too. And I have the deed. It's legal and binding." Jonah's rough hands gripped the bars. "Martha, these men are dangerous. The railroad has money, lawyers. And we have truth," she cut in firmly. "You taught me that, with your Bible verses and your quiet ways. You showed me dignity when others showed scorn." Her voice caught. "Let me show you strength in return." In the dim light, she saw his eyes shine with unshed tears. "I trust you," he whispered, "more than I've trusted anyone since before." Martha reached through the bars, her fingers brushing his. "I won't falter," she promised. "Tomorrow we'll present. The deed. Nantan and the others will stand with us." A deputy's boots scraped on wooden floorboards inside. Jonah squeezed her fingers quickly. "Go home safe," he murmured. "I'll be praying for us both." Martha stepped back into the shadows, watching until Jonah's face disappeared from the window. The stars had multiplied overhead, bright and steady in the spring night. She thought of that first desperate night in the snowstorm, how she'd believed herself at the end of hope. Instead, she'd found a beginning. Moving quietly through the sleeping town, Martha lifted her face to the star-filled sky. Tomorrow would bring its own storms, but tonight she felt the strength of gathered allies, the power of truth, and the steady warmth of Jonah's trust filling her heart. She wasn't just fighting for water rights now. She was fighting for home, for dignity, for the family she and Jonah had begun to build. And this time, she wasn't fighting alone. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Martha stood near the back, her hands smoothing her best dress, the one she'd carefully mended by lamplight. The courtroom benches creaked as people filed in, filling the space with whispers and shuffling boots. Railroad men in expensive suits clustered near the front, their clean collars and polished boots marking them as outsiders. Behind them sat townsfolk and settlers, some casting curious glances at Martha, others deliberately looking away. The air felt thick with tension and the lingering scent of pipe tobacco. Reverend Alcott touched Martha's elbow gently. "Remember," he murmured, "speak clear and true. The Lord sees your heart." Martha nodded, clutching her deed. The paper felt fragile in her trembling fingers, its creases soft from years of being folded in her Bible. Nantan stood quietly nearby, his dignified presence drawing subtle stares from the crowd. The judge entered, his black robes swishing as he took his seat. He was a thin man with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. The railroad's lawyer rose first, a sleek man named Harrison with a watch chain that gleamed as he moved. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this case is quite simple. The railroad has legally purchased land for essential development. These additional claims," his eyes flicked dismissively toward Martha, "are merely attempts to obstruct progress." Martha's heart pounded as the bailiff called her name. Her boots echoed on the floorboards as she walked forward. She felt the weight of every stare, heard the muffled snickers as she passed the railroad men. "Mrs. Keene," Harrison said, emphasizing her married name with subtle mockery. "Perhaps you could explain how you came by these supposed water rights? Through your hasty marriage of convenience?" Heat flooded Martha's cheeks, but she lifted her chin. "The water rights were legally recorded with my first husband's property," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have the deed right here, signed and witnessed." "Ah, yes, your first husband." Harrison's smile was sharp. "And now, finding yourself in difficult circumstances, you arranged a quick marriage to a known recluse? How fortunate that his land adjoins the creek in question." Before Martha could respond, the courtroom door opened. Heads turned as Jonah was led in, his hands shackled. Martha's breath caught. He looked tired, his face unshaven, but his eyes found hers immediately. In that shared glance, she felt strength flow between them like a current. "Your Honor," Harrison continued, "I submit that this marriage is nothing but a convenient fiction, arranged to interfere with legitimate business interests. The woman's condition—" He gestured vaguely at Martha's sighs, drawing more snickers. "Suggests desperation rather than genuine attachment." "Objection!" Reverend Alcott stood suddenly, his weathered face flushed with anger. "Your Honor, I performed that marriage myself. It was legally binding and witnessed before God." The judge gestured for the Reverend to approach. "You can speak to the legitimacy of this union?" "I can, Your Honor." Reverend Alcott's voice rang with conviction. "I've married many couples in my years of service, some for love, some for practical reasons, all blessed by the Almighty. This marriage, though quick, was properly performed with witnesses present. The documents were filed correctly." Martha watched Jonah as the Reverend spoke. His face remained calm, but she saw his fingers flex against the shackles, as if wanting to reach for her. Nantan stepped forward next, his movement graceful and unhurried. The courtroom hushed. He spoke in clear, careful English, his dignity silencing even Harrison's attempts to interrupt. "The creek has given life to my people for many generations," he said. "We have shared its waters with settlers who respect the land. This woman and her husband have shown such respect. They offer shelter, break bread with all who come in peace." He gestured to the railroad men. "These others speak only of taking, of cutting the land with iron. They do not see how the water connects all who live here." The judge's pen scratched across paper as he made notes. "The deed, if you please," he said, holding out his hand. Martha stepped forward, offering the document. Her fingers shook slightly as she released it. The judge adjusted his spectacles, studying each line with careful attention. The courthouse grew warm as afternoon sun slanted through the windows. People shifted on the hard benches. Still, the judge read on. Harrison cleared his throat. "Your Honor, surely a simple property matter needn't take—" "Simple?" The judge looked up sharply. "Nothing about water rights in this territory is simple, Counselor. Lives depend on these decisions." He returned to his reading. Martha's feet ached from standing, but she didn't move. She felt Jonah's presence behind her, steady as a mountain. The shadows lengthened across the courthouse floor as the judge reviewed additional papers, comparing dates and signatures. Finally, as dusk began to gather outside the windows, the judge set down his papers. The room grew utterly still. "Having reviewed all documents and testimony," he began, his voice measured, "I find the water rights deed presented by Martha Price Keene to be valid and binding. Her marriage to Jonah Keene extends these rights to include their joint property. The creek waters cannot be diverted without their permission." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Martha's knees weakened with relief. She heard Harrison's sharp objection, but it seemed distant, unimportant. She turned to look at Jonah and found him already watching her, his eyes bright with pride and something deeper. "Furthermore," the judge continued, raising his voice over the growing murmur, "I find no evidence to support charges against Jonah Keene. He is to be released immediately." The gavel cracked against wood. "Court is adjourned." The bailiff moved to unlock Jonah's shackles. Martha wanted to run to him, but made herself walk slowly, deliberately, past the scowling railroad men. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her rush. Jonah rubbed his wrists where the shackles had been. When Martha reached him, he took her hand in both of his, holding it like something precious. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Nanton approached, touching his heart in greeting. Reverend Alcott beamed at them both. Around them, the courthouse buzzed with conversation as people filed out into the gathering dusk. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The railroad men's dark looks promised as much. But tonight, Martha stood tall beside her husband, feeling the solid truth of belonging, of justice served, of faith rewarded. The water still flowed in the creek, as it had for generations, and now it would continue to flow, bringing life to all who respected its gift. The courthouse erupted in angry mutters after the judge's ruling. Railroad men clustered together, their faces dark with barely contained fury. Harrison, the railroad's lawyer, whispered furiously with his associates, gesturing sharply toward Martha and Jonah. Before anyone could leave, Jonah stepped forward. His chains were gone, but he moved with the careful dignity of a man who knew the weight of bonds. "Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "If I might speak?" The judge paused in gathering his papers, studying Jonah's weathered face. "The case is decided, Mr. Keene, but you may speak." Martha watched her husband straighten his shoulders. The late afternoon light streaming through the courthouse windows caught the silver in his hair, the scars on his hands. When he spoke, his voice held none of the bitterness she might have expected. "This valley's water ain't just mine and Martha's," he began. "Never was, truth be told. The Apache people knew it first, shared it with settlers like myself, even the railroad men." He nodded toward the scowling group. "They got their own need for it, running those steam engines." A murmur rippled through the courthouse. Martha saw surprise flash across faces that had moments ago shown only contempt. Deputy Carver shifted uncomfortably near the door, his badge catching the light. "I killed a man once," Jonah continued, his voice heavy with memory. "Over water rights, if you can believe it. Thought justice meant taking what was mine, no matter the cost." He shook his head slowly. "Took me years of solitude to learn different. True justice. The kind that lasts comes from sharing, not taking. Martha felt tears prick her eyes. She had never heard Jonah speak so many words at once, let alone in public. His voice carried the ring of hard-won truth. "So, I'm proposing we share the water," he said. "Fair portions for all. Settlers, railroad, and Apache families passing through. We can draw up agreements, set times for each to take what they need. Nobody goes thirsty, nobody loses their livelihood." Harrison stepped forward, his face flushed. "You expect us to beg for water we could simply take? The railroad has the power to—" "To what?" Jonah's quiet question cut through Harrison's bluster. "To fight? To shed blood over something that belongs to none of us and all of us?" He gestured towards the window, where the creek's waters glinted in the distance. "The good book says, 'Blessed are the merciful.' Reckon that means showing mercy even to those who might not show it back." Martha saw several townspeople nodding. Old Mrs. Peterson, who had often mocked Martha's size, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even some of the railroad men looked thoughtful, though Harrison still fumed. The judge cleared his throat. "An interesting proposal, Mr. Keene. The court would look favorably on a formal agreement for water sharing, properly drawn up and signed by all parties." Nantan stepped forward, his dark eyes fixed on Jonah. "My people would witness such an agreement," he said. "We have seen too much fighting over things that should bring life, not death." Deputy Carver moved suddenly, his spurs jingling on the wooden floor. He approached Jonah, keys jangling in his hands. "Here," he said gruffly, reaching for the shackles that still hung from the bailiff's belt. "Let me get those off proper." His face was red as he worked the locks, refusing to meet Jonah's eyes. When the chains fell away, he stepped back, touching his hat brim in a gesture that might have been respect. The courthouse slowly emptied, people filing out into the cold evening air. Martha heard their whispers, but the tone had changed. Where there had been mockery of her size and Jonah's scars, now she caught words like wisdom and fair-minded. Harrison and his railroad men stalked out last, but even they seemed subdued. The fight had drained from them, replaced by something that looked almost like consideration. Jonah turned to Martha, his eyes soft in the fading light. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. Together they walked out of the courthouse, their steps matched as if they'd been walking side by side for years instead of months. The crowd parted for them, not in scorn, but with a new kind of deference. Martha heard Mrs. Peterson whisper to her neighbor, "Did you see how he stood up for what's right? And her with that valid deed all along, we surely misjudged them both." The evening air bit cold and sharp as they made their way to where their mule waited patiently. Jonah helped Martha onto the wagon seat before climbing up beside her. The town fell away behind them as they rode toward home, the wagon wheels crunching on the half-frozen ground. Their cabin came into view just as the first stars began pricking through the darkening sky. The sight of the burned barn still hurt. Black timbers stark against the snow, the lingering smell of ash. But somehow its absence mattered less tonight. Light spilled from the cabin windows, warm and welcoming against the gathering dark. Inside, Martha lit the lamps while Jonah built up the fire. The familiar routine felt different now, filled with a peace neither had expected to find. Martha watched her husband move around the cabin, noting how his shoulders had lost their defensive hunch, how his steps seemed lighter. "You surprised them all today," she said softly, setting out cups for evening tea. "Speaking up like that about sharing the water?" Jonah paused by the fireplace, his face thoughtful in the flickering light. "Reckon I surprised myself," he admitted. "But seeing you stand so brave in that courthouse, holding to what's right without holding to hate." He shook his head. made me remember what the good book says about overcoming evil with good. Martha felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She looked around their cabin, seeing it with new eyes. The rough-hewn table where they shared meals, the scripture verses nailed above the door, the quilt on their bed. All of it spoke not of isolation now, but of home. Even without the barn, they had everything that mattered. Jonah crossed to where she stood and took her hand again. His touch was gentle, reverent almost, as if he too marveled at the strange path that had brought them together. Outside, snow began to fall softly, adding another layer of peace to the quiet evening. The water still flowed in the creek, its song muffled by ice but constant. Come spring, it would run clear and strong, nurturing not just their land, but all who came to share in its blessing. Martha smiled, thinking how God had indeed used a storm to knit lives together, not just hers and Jonah's, but perhaps an entire community's. They sat together by the fire, hands clasped, watching flames dance and listening to the comfortable sounds of their home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, agreements to draft, trust to build, a barn to rebuild. But tonight was for savoring the victory of mercy over might, of justice tempered with grace. Martha felt Jonah's thumb brush across her knuckles, a tender gesture that spoke louder than words. In the gentle quiet of their cabin, she knew they had found something far more precious than water rights or legal victories. They had found belonging, purpose, and a love that had grown from necessity into choice. The snow continued falling outside their windows, each flake a tiny blessing from heaven, while inside, the warmth of newfound peace filled every corner of their home. Spring brought more than just thawing snow to the valley. It brought the steady rhythm of hammers, the scrape of saws, and the low murmur of voices working together. Where Jonah's burned barn had stood, a new structure began to rise, built by hands that had once pointed in scorn. Thomas Wheeler, the blacksmith, arrived first one morning, his wagon loaded with nails and metal fittings. "Heard you could use some help," he said gruffly, not meeting Jonah's eyes. "Ain't right. What happened to your barn?" More followed. By mid-morning, half a dozen men from town stood in the muddy yard, shuffling their feet until Reverend Alcott took charge. "Well, brothers," he called out, "let's get to work." Martha watched from the cabin door as Jonah worked alongside men who'd whispered against him just weeks before. Their movements were awkward at first, but the familiar labor of barn raising soon smoothed away the strain. Nantan arrived with several Apache families, bringing fresh-cut logs from the high forest. The men nodded to Jonah, then set to work stripping bark and shaping beams. Their children played near the creek, their laughter mixing with the sound of axes and saws. Martha found herself directing traffic, surprising herself with her own authority. "The hay storage needs to face north," she called out, pointing, "and we'll want the milking stall close to the door." The men listened, respecting her practical knowledge. Her size, once a source of mockery, proved an advantage. She could lift and carry alongside the men, her endurance outlasting some of the younger workers. "Much obliged, Ms. Keene," they'd say, with new respect in their voices. By noon, women from town began arriving with baskets and pots. The same ladies who had turned away from Martha in church now spread blankets on the grass, setting out bread and stew for the workers. Mrs. Peterson, who had been one of the most vocal critics, approached Martha with a covered dish. "Made my special berry cobbler," she said softly. "And I brought something else." From her wagon, she led out a young Jersey cow, her coat gleaming in the spring sun. "She's gentle, gives sweet milk. Consider her an apology from those of us who judged too harsh." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say," "Don't say anything," Mrs. Peterson replied, then added in a whisper, "You're the bravest woman I've known, standing up in that courthouse. Some of us were just too blind to see your worth before." Throughout the afternoon, more gifts appeared. Sacks of flour and seed corn, a crate of chickens, lengths of calico for curtains. Each came with mumbled apologies and genuine warmth. The barn rose steadily, its framework reaching toward the sky. Martha watched Jonah direct the raising of the center beam, his quiet voice carrying natural authority. He caught her eye across the yard and smiled, a full, unguarded smile that transformed his scarred face. When dusk approached, the workers began gathering their tools. "We'll be back tomorrow," Thomas Wheeler announced. "Ain't leaving till it's done proper." After the others left, Martha and Jonah sat at their table, too tired to do more than pick at their supper. But their exhaustion felt good. Honest. Jonah reached across and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "Did you see young Jim Carter working alongside Nantan's sons?" Martha asked, smiling. "Never thought I'd see that." Jonah nodded. "Reckon sharing work builds bridges better than words ever could." They both chuckled softly, remembering how Jim had tried to learn Apache words while raising posts, making everyone laugh with his pronunciation. Martha looked around their cabin, feeling the deep contentment of belonging. The new curtains from town hung at the windows, the milk cow lowed softly in the temporary pen, and tomorrow would bring another day of community building something together. "We've put down roots here," she said quietly. "Real ones, deeper than just having land or water rights." "That we have," Jonah agreed, his voice warm with certainty. "That we surely have." The evening settled around them like a blessing, filled with the lingering echoes of hammers and friendly voices, the promise of tomorrow's work, and the knowledge that they had found their true home. Not just in the cabin or the valley, but in the hearts of a community that had learned to see with new eyes. Spring crept into the valley like a gentle awakening. The creek banks, once locked in ice, now sprouted tender green shoots that swayed in the warming breeze. Wildflowers dotted the meadow with splashes of purple and gold, while overhead, geese called their way north against the brightening sky. In the workshop behind their cabin, Jonah bent over his latest project, carefully sanding smooth curves into solid oak. Wood chips scattered around his boots as he worked, the rhythmic scrape of his tools mixing with birdsong. He'd been laboring in secret during early mornings and late evenings, pouring his heart into every detail. Martha noticed his absences but didn't pry. She kept busy tending to their growing homestead. The Jersey cow needed milking, the new chickens scattered feed across the yard, and the garden required turning for spring planting. Sometimes she caught herself humming as she worked, surprising herself with this newfound contentment. One evening, as the sun painted the mountains gold, Jonah called Martha to the porch. She stepped outside, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. There, gleaming in the last light, stood a beautifully crafted rocking chair. Its arms curved with grace, its seat wide and welcoming, built to hold her comfortably without complaint. "It's yours," Jonah said simply, running his hand along the smooth backrest. "Every home needs a proper rocker on its porch." Martha's fingers trembled as she touched the polished wood. Tears welled in her eyes as she remembered darker days, the whispers, the cruel laughter, the certainty that no man would ever want her. Now here stood her husband, offering not just any chair, but one crafted specifically for her, celebrating rather than mocking her size. "It's beautiful," she whispered, sinking into its embrace. The chair welcomed her perfectly, as if it had known her all along. Jonah had even carved delicate leaves along the arms, matching the spring buds by the creek. They sat together as twilight deepened, watching stars appear one by one. The chair's gentle creak kept time with cricket song, a melody of home and peace. Finally, Jonah broke their comfortable silence. "Been meaning to tell you something," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "That night you came to my door, I was scared." Martha turned to look at him, surprised. "Scared? Of me?" "Of myself." Jonah clasped his hands together. "I'd been alone so long, I was sinking into darkness, seeing only ghosts and regrets. When you knocked—" He paused, searching for words. "I knew if I didn't grab hold of something real, something good, I'd lose myself completely. That's why I demanded marriage so sudden-like. More fear than faith, I reckon." Martha rocked slowly, remembering that desperate night. "I thought you were just being proper, not wanting scandal." "Proper had little to do with it." Jonah's smile held a touch of sadness. "I needed saving as much as you did. Maybe more." The lamp in the cabin window cast a warm glow across the porch as Martha reached for his hand. "When I was wandering in that storm," she said softly, "I prayed for shelter. Just shelter. Never dreamed God would send me a home, a purpose." She wiped tears with her free hand. "Even if it started with fear, look what he's made of it." "He does work in mysterious ways," Jonah agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Sometimes I wonder, what if we had young ones someday? This valley's got room for family." Martha's heart swelled at the word family. "I'd like that," she whispered, "to fill this place with life and learning." They talked late into the night, sharing dreams they'd been too cautious to voice before. About teaching children to read by lamplight, about passing on their hard-won wisdom about mercy and justice, about growing old together in this valley that had taught them both to start over. As the moon rose high, casting silver light on the new-leaved trees, their words gradually gave way to peaceful silence. Martha rocked gently in her chair. Not just furniture now, but a symbol of permanence, of belonging. Jonah's hand remained warm in hers, their fingers intertwined in wordless devotion. The lamp flickered low in the window, but neither moved to tend it. This moment felt too precious to break. This quiet acknowledgement that what had begun in desperate necessity had bloomed into something far more beautiful than either could have imagined. Summer embraced the highland valley with gentle warmth. The creek that had sparked so much strife now flowed strong and clear, its waters nurturing life on all sides. Tender green shoots pushed through rich soil in neat rows across the valley floor, promising a bountiful harvest to come. Near the cabin, Martha's garden flourished, vegetables spreading their leaves wide beneath the Colorado sun. Morning glories climbed the newly built barn walls, their purple blooms opening to greet each dawn. The Jersey cow grazed contentedly in sweet grass, while chickens scratched in the yard, their clucking a homely melody that made Martha smile as she worked. Even the wild roses that dotted the creek banks seemed to bloom more vibrantly this year, as if nature itself celebrated the peace that had settled over the land. On a bright Sunday morning, church bells rang out across the valley, their clear tones carrying on the summer breeze. Martha stood before their cabin's small mirror, pinning her hair carefully. She wore her best dress, faded but clean, with a touch of lace at the collar, a far cry from the desperate woman who had once trudged through winter snow. Jonah waited by the door in his Sunday clothes, his scarred face softened by contentment. They walked side by side down the dusty road toward town, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Martha remembered their first Sunday together, how the townsfolk had whispered and stared. Now, as they approached the white-painted church, neighbors called out warm greetings. Children waved, women smiled, and men tipped their hats with genuine respect. "Fine morning, Mrs. Keene," called Mrs. Anderson, who once had turned away in scorn. "Those tomato starts you gave me are coming up beautiful." "Your cow's cream makes the best butter I've ever tasted," added another woman, touching Martha's arm as they climbed the church steps. Inside, sunlight streamed through plain glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across worn wooden pews. Martha and Jonah took their usual seat, and she felt his hand find hers as the congregation settled. The familiar sense of polish and prayer books wrapped around them like a comfortable shawl. Reverend Alcott stood before his flock, his kind eyes crinkling as he surveyed the gathered faces. His sermon spoke of providence, how God's hand could be seen in the most unexpected places. As he concluded, he gestured toward Martha and Jonah. "We've witnessed in our own valley what faith and courage can accomplish," the preacher said, his voice carrying clear to the rafters. "When we choose mercy over vengeance, when we stand firm in what's right while extending grace to others, that's when miracles happen. Brother Jonah, Sister Martha, you've shown us this truth in action." Martha felt tears prick her eyes as heads nodded in agreement. Jonah's hand tightened on hers, and she could feel a slight tremor in his usually steady grip. They had come so far from that desperate winter night. After the service, they shared fellowship with neighbors who once shunned them. The banker who had seized Martha's old cabin even approached, hat in hand, to apologize for his harsh actions. Martha's forgiveness, offered simply and sincerely, seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders. The afternoon sun was sinking toward the mountains as they finally headed home. Their rebuilt barn stood proud against the golden sky, its fresh timbers a testament to community restored. Martha paused to gather eggs, while Jonah tended to the evening chores, their routine comfortable as a well-worn quilt. But as darkness began to settle over the valley, Jonah surprised her. "Come with me," he said softly, taking her hand. He led her to their favorite spot by the creek, where wildflowers nodded in the evening breeze. Stars were just beginning to appear overhead, bright and clear in the mountain air. Martha's breath caught as she saw what he had prepared. Lanterns hung from low branches, their warm light dancing on the water. A quilt was spread on the soft grass, and familiar words from Scripture lay open on its folds. Jonah turned to face her, his eyes bright with emotion. He took both her hands in his, and Martha felt her heart swell as she recognized the echo of their first meeting in his next words. "Only if you'll be my wife tonight," he whispered, but this time his voice held no desperate condition. Only love, pure and deep as the creek beside them. His smile transformed his scarred face into something beautiful, and Martha saw in it all the months of growing trust, shared struggles, and quiet joys that had brought them to this moment. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she answered, "Yes, tonight and all our nights to come." Under the star-strewn sky, they renewed their vows, not in haste before witnesses, but in the privacy of their own hearts. Jonah's voice was thick with emotion as he promised to cherish and protect, while Martha's declarations of love and faithfulness rang clear and true across the water. When their words were spent, they sat together on the quilt, watching the lantern light play on the creek's surface. In the distance, their cabin window glowed warm and welcoming, a beacon of hope in the highland night, promising shelter to any weary traveler who might pass by. Martha leaned her head against Jonah's shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, remembering how she had once thought herself unwanted and alone. Now she knew better. God had indeed used a storm to knit their lives together, creating something far more precious than either could have imagined that desperate winter night. The creek murmured its eternal song as darkness settled fully over the valley. In that peaceful moment, Martha and Jonah sat wrapped in the certainty of belonging. To each other, to this land, and to the community that had finally embraced them both. Their cabin light continued to shine through the darkness, no longer a desperate haven, but a testament to love's power to transform and heal. Below in the town, church bells tolled the evening hour, their clear notes carrying peace across the highland night. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.